The Texas Hispanic Policy Foundation presents Our Story, hosted by the Foundation's chairman and president, Jason Villalba. Each week on Our Story, hear the personal and intimate stories of Hispanics all across Texas, told in their own voices. Our Story provides insight into a community of people who are literally and figuratively changing the complexion of the United States. This is who we are.
Welcome back to the Texas Hispanic Policy Foundation's Our Story. Each week, we bring you the intimate and personal stories of Texans all across our great state who share our heritage, our Hispanic heritage. Today, we have a very special guest and a dear friend of mine who I had an opportunity to really get to know on the trail to run for the mayor of Dallas. Regina Montoya has a background and a story that's quite exceptional. Her list of accolades goes on, and we're going to cover quite a few of those. But I'm just so excited today to have my good friend Regina Montoya join me. Regina, welcome to our show and Our Story.
Jason, what an honor it is to be with you and with this incredible podcast that you are doing for the Texas Hispanic Policy Foundation. Thank you for your leadership, for just thinking up this extraordinary organization. What a great day to be with you. Thank you.
Well, you're kind, but you should also admit to our listeners that you shared in the genesis of this idea. You know, the idea of reaching out to Hispanics, to understanding Texas Hispanics in a deeper, more meaningful way was something that you and I and others came up with over the course of the last decade or so. But during the campaign where we became very good friends, we had an opportunity to talk about these issues. And you shared with me some of your experience, and I think it was your thought leadership that really was able to galvanize this organization, and having the opportunity to talk with you about some of your thoughts on those kinds of issues, I think is going to be very enlightening for folks. So let's start from the very beginning. Let's start with where you're from. I know you were born in Tucumcari, New Mexico, but you got to Texas as soon as you could. I'd love to hear about the early days and your grandparents and your parents and a little bit about your background.
Well, thank you, Jason. And my story is like that of a lot of Latinos, a lot of Hispanics who have lived here. It's varied in this sense. When I was born in Tucumcari, as you mentioned, my mother's parents, who were immigrants from Mexico, had come to the United States, as many immigrants came, with just the clothes on their back, with just what they could carry, and they settled in New Mexico. And they didn't have a great education. My grandfather probably had about a third grade education. My grandmother was the same, not much education. I remember visiting her several times. She moved from Tucumcari to El Paso after my grandfather had passed away. And when she was living there, she used to just love the telenovelas. These are those books it's actually novellas. These are books that you read, but they actually look almost like comic books because there are a lot of pictures with them. And I think that the reason for that is that she couldn't read very well. And so the illustration helped her know what was happening in the story. But the best part of all of this is that when my parents got married and they were living in Tucumcari, which is where my father had gotten a job because he was working for the Corps of Engineers at that time. He had graduated from college through the GI Bill after having served in World War II, found himself in Tucumcari, met my mother, who was a native of there, and we lived there for about 3 years. As a result, because my grandparents were not able to speak English, I actually learned Spanish before English living there. But it was a great time. And when I would go back to visit my grandmother and my mother would tell me the stories, it was one of those idyllic times. And I think it was great for my parents. But that only happened for about 3 years. And then we moved to the big city of Albuquerque.
Albuquerque, New Mexico. Your grandparents made that journey that so many of our ancestors have made and so many of us have made to come to the great United States. They had to leave their home. And maybe you don't have the story, but I always like to hear the stories of the grandparents or parents or even us, but when we were back in the old country and what brought us to the new country and what was the catalyst that brought people to the United States in the first place.
Well, this is the best part of the story when I mentioned to you that Latinos, Hispanics have such a varied background. So I mentioned my grandparents on my mother's side, my maternal grandparents, who came to the United States because they were seeking the opportunities for their children that they knew that they weren't going to have in Mexico. So a lot of it was economic to have these opportunities. This, again, the American dream was just so well known among everyone in the world, which has brought so many immigrant families to the United States. That was my grandparents, my maternal grandparents' story. But my grandparents, my father's parents, my paternal grandparents, their family were long-time residents of the northern New Mexico area. They actually never came to the United States. The United States came to them. As with a number of Hispanics who live in the northern part of New Mexico, southern part of Colorado, Arizona, many of them had actually come to what was then the northern parts of Mexico, very independent people who wanted to come to this country, probably from Spain in many cases, and make sure that Mexico at the time was strong, but probably so independent they wanted to be as far away as from the national government as possible, and they found themselves in the northern regions. And so my paternal grandparents actually, the United States came to them. So it's that kind of story that Latinos have all over. And so on that side of the family, we've been here generations.
Texas and Texans have a lot of similar stories where, we were Texas before Texas was Texas, and then certainly before it was part of the United States. And so many of our stories that we have began with people who were here before, the United States, took the land of Texas and New Mexico. And so people ask, well, where'd you come from? It's like, well, we were here before you were here. And I think that's something that is really a theme that I hear running through a lot of the stories. Give me
and especially when, Jason, when I think of my grandfather, my paternal grandfather, he went into the coal mines at the age of 13. And when you would hear the stories about these young kids in the North, and again, at that point, in what was then becoming what was then the United States, you heard the story of a lot of immigrant families. And so in my father's family, he grew up in a coal mining town because that's where my grandfather had gotten his work starting at the age of 13. You would find so many immigrants from Poland, from Italy, from all across the globe who were in these melting pot cities. And so for my father, I think he was able to learn a little bit of a number of different languages. But at the end of the day, English was what sort of brought everybody kind of together as they all started to try to learn English and to find a way to communicate.
Almost every story that I hear, grandparents and parents certainly, but grandparents seem to have a larger presence in the lives of Latinos in Texas. Can you tell me a story about your grandparents and their influence on you, either your mom's parents or your dad's parents, just grandparents in general? I love to hear those kinds of stories. So I'd love to hear from you about that.
One of those stories I just thought about just a few days ago. I spent several summers in El Paso, which is where my grandmother had moved to. And part of that was to reacquaint myself with Spanish, to learn the language and to be able to communicate. My mom really wanted me to be sure to be bilingual. And because we had moved away and now I was in school, I wasn't speaking Spanish nearly as frequently. My late mother was absolutely bilingual and she wanted me to have that opportunity. So I remember those days, spending them with my grandmother in the summertime in El Paso. And waking up in the morning because she would start cooking from an early time. And she would make these incredible beans early, and flour tortillas, which would always wake me. I would, this is summertime vacation. I wanted to sleep late, but I could never do that because the smells, the aroma of her taking care of me just woke me up immediately. And so I think of that as one of those times when I always felt so safe and secure, being with my grandmother, knowing that there was always somebody there who would be there for me no matter what and would support me and would just coddle me in every which way. My name is Regina, which means Queen. And my mother specifically picked that name because of a hymn that she had heard in Catholic Mass that she attended. And I think that was sort of part of what it was with my family, is that I always, as this, young granddaughter, was sort of their princess. And it was, I think back to that every time I smell something that smells like that. I think of those really beautiful times of someone who unconditionally loved me for everything that I could do and encouraged me in every which way to do the things that she might not have had the opportunity to do.
Hispanics will talk often about food, and often it's in a joking way. But I think food and our food culture in the Hispanic community is very real because of what you just mentioned. It represents to us family and comfort and safety, and every Hispanic knows the smell of abuelitas tortillas and beans on the stove. And when you say that, I've already had lunch, but my mouth is already starting to water just thinking about
For
that.
sure. I think this is something that binds us. And maybe the other part of that too is that for my grandmother, who, raised her 5 children, didn't have great health care, so she would have had more children, but they didn't live past infancy. It was an opportunity, cooking these incredible meals to bring the family together. I often remember the great gatherings that we would have, not only with my grandparents, but aunts and uncles, tias and tios, who would come together with my cousins, and we'd have these large gatherings. And, of course, now in the day of COVID, that's been such a big problem, because that is such a part of our culture, to come together with our families. And being with our families is that place of safety. So this has just upended every kind of notion of tradition that we've had in our families, whether it's yours or mine or any of the others that we know. It is such a tough time, because it is one of being together with those that love us and unconditionally love us.
Yeah, it's taken that from us. And, in our immediate direct households, I mean, we've gotten closer, I know, in my home, but having the ability to talk and spend time with my parents and my in-laws and my grandmother has been much more difficult. So I recognize that concern. Let's talk about your mom and dad. Your mom and dad were obviously the greatest influence in your life. And your dad has such an interesting story. I want to have him on the show as well. I'd love to hear about his background in World War II, and then, what your mom did when he was overseas, and just a little bit about growing up in that household.
What was interesting for my dad is, as I mentioned, he grew up in a coal mining town, and he went into World War II in 1943. He did finish high school. And this is one of those it's something that really separated a lot of the young men at that time, because some of the young men decided to enlist early and not finish high school, but then they would have the opportunity to select one of the services that they would like to go in, whether it's the Navy or, some of these others that they might think, and try to get something more specific. My dad, however, decided that he wanted to finish high school, and he did. And so as soon as he finished high school, he was drafted. And of course, at that point, not a lot of leverage for this young man who has a high school degree from northern New Mexico, and private in the U.S. Army, and was in the infantry, and was stationed basically in Austria and Germany, and a little bit of time in France as well, so in the European side. But what really, I think for him, it was such an eye-opening event. Now, he did have the opportunity to meet a lot of men, young men and students that he went to school with from other parts of the world, because they were immigrants that had come to try to get these coal mining jobs in northern New Mexico, that took their fathers, not only from New Mexico, but all the way up to Montana and Wyoming. But what was interesting for him is that, and maybe this is something that we talk about now, the great equalizer later on, because at the time, the armed forces were segregated. And when my dad, though, because he was from northern New Mexico, was put into an area with not only white non-Hispanics and other Latinos, he really met people who had this worldview about education, and that would become the great equalizer. So for him, that was something that he really wanted to take advantage of, was the opportunity to go to school on the GI Bill. And he did exactly that. But he had some great stories about being in the World War II areas and thinking about what his jobs were. And you may recall these great stories of times when some of these privates would get and pick up all of these types of vehicles and try to drive them into the ocean so that people couldn't reuse them and the other side couldn't. And he was very involved in a lot of those kinds of issues. But, think about these young 20-year-olds, 18-year-olds in this theater in Europe, far, far, far away from home, and making sure that they felt so strongly about this incredible country that they were part of. And I think that was what really drove my father, and really he reflects upon that more recently when he thinks about some of what has happened in Washington. A couple of weeks, back when we saw what happened at the Capitol, that just really shocked him, because for him everything was about what could we do to ensure the sovereignty of this country and making sure that the American dream was available for so many others following him.
Your dad was unusual in the sense that he comes back from the service, and Latino man and in the 40s going to college was not common, I'm guessing. Were his parents college educated? Did he have a lot of influences?
Right. This is what was nice about having these other young men with him who decided all to come back, but it was hard. He came back with a group of 3 or 4 white, non-Hispanic friends who all wanted to go to school together. And he decided when they were going to do it, he would do it as well. He was the first person in his family to graduate from high school. So there wasn't anyone out there kind of giving him this kind of advice and support. And when these young men, including my dad, tried to get housing, because it was very difficult to secure housing after World War II. It was in very short supply, and it was scrambled to try to get housing for everyone. So when he and his friends wanted to go to the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque, he was going to room with them. And sure enough, the first landlord that they went to was a woman who said that she would rent to the white non-Hispanic men, but not to my father, because as she said, he was a Mexican.
Right.
So she wouldn't rent to him. But the other young men said, look, if we were ready to die together, if we were ready to, help each other during the war, surely we will stay together and find a place to live. And so my dad tried to tell him, look, it's going to be really tough to do this. You guys go ahead and take it. I'll find a way. And they said, no, absolutely not. And so that became his sort of support group. But that's one of those indications, that's one of those examples, too, of when you get to know others really well in situations like that, people that don't look like you, that don't sound like you, that's how you create and break down the barriers of discrimination and the barriers that create systemic racism. That's what you have to do, is getting to know folks and getting to know those others. And that's what happened for my dad. And so my dad, who was a really good in math and science, decided to pursue a degree in civil engineering, and he did. I credit my dad so much because when people ask me, well, how did you get to college? How did you get to law school? And these others, I say, I did it on the GI Bill, and sort of. And they said, what do you mean you did it on the GI Bill? I said, because if it hadn't been for my dad getting the GI Bill, I'm not sure how it could have impacted me. And it certainly would have impacted my mother, because she went to college afterwards, because he had the ability to have this position with the Corps of Engineers that gave him and gave our family the opportunity to continue. And so for my dad, he recognized that education was the great equalizer. And let me tell you, he was one of the first people that said to me, you need to get a really good education. And I want you to think about a profession that you can take care of yourself and your kids if you ever had to do that by yourself. And so I credit a lot of any successes that I have had to that of my father and that experience that he had as a little 20-year-old in World War II. And by the way, my dad is now 97 years old and doing great. So it's such an honor to have a dad like this who's with us. It's a blessing every single day.
What an example of an inspiration that he must have been growing up to, just to see, one, that he decides to go to high school and finish high school, unlike probably many of his friends who decided to do something else, to go to the fields, to go to work. And then to find that college was going to be his future after the service and to be dedicated to that. And then to send your mom as well. I mean, that must have really had an impact on you and your not only desire to go to college, but it becomes part of who we are. We must go. Like my children don't have a choice. They're going to college, right? And I think that's probably where you were a generation ago when they instilled that in you. Is that right?
Oh, absolutely. And I think one of the things that it was always a funny story for me. My mother went back to college when she had the four of us. I'm the eldest of four. I'm the only girl. I have three younger brothers. And when the youngest started school, my mother, who had not had the opportunity to go to college, when she met my dad, she had been out of school for a couple of years from high school and was a great student, wanted to be a nurse, which would have required her leaving the small town of Tucumcari to go to probably El Paso, which is where her sisters were, married sisters. But her dad wouldn't let her do that. He just felt, again, sort of the old country thoughts about a young girl being on her own, especially an unmarried young girl being on her own. He just wouldn't permit that and wouldn't give her the permission to do so. And so, but here she was, this brilliant young woman. And when all of us were now in school, she decided to go back to school. So she juggled getting her degree in 3 to 3.5 years. She was able to do student teaching, became a teacher, teaching ultimately in Dallas. But what I remember, though, days that I would be complaining about how hard it was in school. And here I was at this fabulous school up in the Northeast, Wellesley College. And, we had all of our dorm kinds of opportunities with food being, we could get food. I didn't have to cook. I didn't have to do any of these things. And it was hard to complain too much because here was my mother who had finished school just a few years before I, and she managed to do that with 4 kids, the household, doing all of those sorts of things. And so didn't have a lot of room to complain. Let me put it that way.
How does a young Hispanic from New Mexico and then Texas find Wellesley? Even on a map, I wouldn't have known where that was when I was your age. And then, of course,
when I was, it was a great story, on this, Jason, thinking about what prompted me to leave Albuquerque and go a couple thousand miles to a school that I had never seen and did go sight unseen. So when I was in a grade school, I was a very precocious reader of biographies. I just read every biography that one could get in our little school library. And I managed to start reading several books about Helen Keller. Helen Keller, who, overcame the disabilities that she never looked at as disabilities, but more of as opportunities, went to school in Boston. And there were the descriptions of what it was like in this incredible intellectual mecca. And I was so intrigued by it that by the 8th grade, I decided I was going to go to school in Boston. And I found one little teacher there that didn't think that this was the craziest idea of all time, as a young 8th grader. And she gave me some information about these schools. She managed to find couple of pamphlets about some schools called the Seven Sisters. And back in those days, there were these schools that were for women. Solely, these were women serving schools. And Wellesley was among those, Vassar back then, which is no longer just for women, but the Seven Sisters. And that's when I decided in 8th grade I was going to go to school in Boston. And I never wavered from that and started creating my high school curricula based on what are the courses that I would need to be sure to take to be able to go to a school in Boston. And I just focused on the Seven Sisters. And that's what I ultimately decided to do and to apply. And, the rest was just wonderful because I was one of only 2 Mexican-American women in my class at Wellesley. So this was still not yet real well known in our community.
So for our listeners who don't know much about Northeastern schools, and we've all heard of the Ivies, but they should know that Wellesley is considered one of the most elite schools in the country at the time for women and now just in general. And so getting in was not just something that happens. I mean, you obviously were quite skilled and did very well in high school and then ultimately ended up in Wellesley. Tell me about life at Wellesley. I mean, the bottom line is you're probably one of the only people of color there. This would be in a time when we just weren't as embraced as we were. Again, I'm not searching for racism stories, but I am curious about your experience, and we talk about this with all of our guests. I'm the first to make clear that we don't have the experience of our African-American brothers and sisters of this just rank racism that they experience, but we certainly have stories. And I imagine at Wellesley, there might be an experience or two that you recall. So what was it like there?
One of the best stories that I remember encountering and thinking about, and it just sort of surprised me because people didn't understand much about Hispanics and Mexican Americans. And, probably because you're in the Northeast, you might have met a few more Hispanics who might have been from either Cuban Americans or Puerto Ricanos or Dominican, for example, but particularly Puerto Ricanos and those from Cuba. And so coming from the Southwest, which is where I was coming from, it was kind of a new experience for many. I remember one of those times that I really thought people need to learn more about our community, because we were trying to have a meeting of all of the Hispanic organizations and Hispanic women, and it's not a big group. So we're talking 25 women or so that wanted to start meeting in one of these groups. And the first place that everybody said is, well, y'all should start meeting at the Slater House. And I thought, well, but that's an international house. We're like Americans. And so that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to me. Well, they could not understand that, even though, as I mentioned to you, with my father's family, which has been here probably as long as many of those folks that might have been close to the Mayflower, they still thought of us as being sort of international students and didn't understand that American component that was such a big part of who we are. And they would have never thought about sending Irish American students to this particular international house for meetings, because it just would never have dawned on them. So I did get the opportunity a couple of decades later, because I was named to the board of trustees at Wellesley College. And they wanted to have another meeting again of the Latino students at Wellesley, and I was going to be the keynote speaker. And don't you know, they wanted to do it at the International House. And I explained to them, it was a problem for me back then. And, this time I actually can say something about it. I think you should have it at the College Club, because, see, we're not necessarily all international students. And for so many of these students, probably 80% of the students that would have been coming to this meeting were actually American citizens. I said, I think we should have one that doesn't necessarily indicate to us that somehow we're these new people that are immigrants, that are not even immigrants, that are international. We really are American. So we got to have it at the College Club instead. And I think ever since then, they've not had any more of the meetings at the International House, recognizing that we're really part of the American fabric.
Now, I know that you were at Wellesley around the same time as Hillary Rodham Clinton, or Hillary Rodham at the time. I know that you ultimately ended up working in the Clinton administration, and you became friends with the senator. So did you meet her at Wellesley, or was that at Harvard, or when did that occur?
Actually, I did at one point, because she and President Clinton were in Arkansas, you would get to see them quite a bit. But how I got to know her was, again, through the Alumni Association activities. She was a few years older than I, so we never overlapped during our time at Wellesley. Paul, my husband, actually did get to know the president at law school, because when they were in law school, because he was at college at Yale when they were there. So he certainly got to meet them a little bit before I did. But I heard so much about her because of all the work that she had done. And that was when I actually got to know her as a result of some of these alumni activities. And for her, because she was a lawyer in Little Rock and I was a lawyer in one of the firms in Dallas, we had a lot of common interests. And I did get to know her, did ask her to come and speak to one of the women lawyer groups events that we have in Dallas called Attorneys Serving the Community, and got to know her really well. And then certainly when President Clinton ran for the presidency, I got to know her even better, because I spent quite a bit of time on that campaign and saw her frequently. And she continues to be very open and very much a part of the Wellesley community. Because there are these secretaries of state, including Madeleine Albright, who went to Wellesley, there is that kind of camaraderie that we see as a result of these extraordinary women. And so she was always someone that I'd heard so much about and she'd done so much in the American Bar Association and so much for women and girl serving groups that was the other way I got to know her as a result of those kinds of interests that she and I both had, but that she really was able to serve as a mentor in many ways because of the way she handled those kinds of issues and became such a subject matter expert on them. I've always thanked her for showing me the way in terms of getting to know these issues and then making it and hopefully trying to make a difference.
Well, she certainly put us on the path to shattering the glass ceiling that we saw shattered yesterday by Kamala Harris. And so that's exciting. I know there's more to come when we see the first female president. So I'm excited for that as a father of two girls, strong women. I know that that's something that is important to you. And having been at Wellesley and spent time with folks that were dedicated to that cause, I know that you've spent a significant part of your life really focusing on that. So as you are educated at Wellesley, you want to stay in this community of Boston. I heard there's a little small law school right across town. I think it's called Harvard Law School, and you ended up at Harvard. Did you go straight from Wellesley to Harvard, or was there a break, or what happened?
So I went straight from Wellesley to Harvard. And for me, the biggest change in my life from an education perspective was going from high school, as we've just talked about, to Wellesley, because I went sight unseen, didn't know a thing about this, I knew sort of in theory what the school was all about, but certainly didn't know anything in terms of having been there and felt it. But Harvard Law School was a little different because it wasn't far from Wellesley. Wellesley is just about 12 miles west of Boston. I spent a lot of time going in and out of Cambridge because there are so many colleges and schools in that area. It was very exciting. But I did want to, to the opportunity, I did work at the Boston Legal Aid Society as a volunteer while I was at Wellesley. And that really was what cemented the idea for me to go on to law school. And I certainly knew a lot about Harvard Law School because of the proximity. And of course, there are a lot of scholars that have gone there that have made a huge difference in the legal community. And so it was so tremendously wonderful to be able to go to Harvard after having gone to Wellesley, because I knew that I would be able to even learn more about the experiences that a school like Harvard would provide.
Were you politically inclined at this point, or did that come later in life? I mean, obviously going to some of the preeminent schools in the country, if not the world, would direct you towards some sort of a political service or a public service. But were you politically motivated or inclined at this point?
I became more politically motivated and active while I was in law school. But part of that, too, was right in my very first year of law school, I met the love of my life, my husband, Paul Coggin, and we got engaged that first year of my first year of law school, which was his second year in law school. And he came there. It was a little convoluted for him because he had gone to college at Yale, and then he was really, really fortunate, was a great student. He received a Rhodes Scholarship and had gone to England for a couple of years, and that turned into 1 year of law school in the United States at Harvard, which is where we met. And we were in the same dorm, so it made it even easier, right, to get to know each other because we'd see each other every day. But because we did get married at the end of my first year in law school, and we spent the next year in England while he was studying for his third year and receiving a degree it's called a diploma in law at Oxford. And during that time, that was when I learned even more about some of the political issues, but international ones as well. And so that when we returned to law school in the fall of the next year, I became more actively engaged. But I had not really gotten so involved in the political side until we moved to Dallas. And there were a number of mentors of ours, for both of us, that got us engaged in this. And for me and for him, for Paul, we met Judge Sarah T. Hughes, who I clerked for after I graduated from law school. And for those listeners, I suspect that all of you are familiar with a very famous photo of the judge, and that is of the judge swearing in LBJ on Air Force One on that terrible day in Dallas. Well, she was just the most remarkable woman. She was the second or third woman federal district judge in the country. She ran for office. In Texas, we elect our judges, and she ran for office, including the Supreme Court, which she narrowly lost because she lost her home city of Highland Park, which is where she lived. But she just was an incredible catalyzing figure for both of us. And I credit much of what we have learned from a political side from Judge Sarah T. Hughes, who just wanted to see women engaged in politics. She wanted to see women elected, and she wanted to see young people get engaged in the process. And that was really who inspired both of us, actually, in getting more engaged in the political process. Paul's family was more engaged when he was growing up, although it was interesting because Paul, is a Democrat and has been part of the Democratic Party ever since college or since law school. But he actually grew up in a Republican family. So he has seen both sides of the political coin, as they say.
Well, that's an interesting or a good segue into, I think, a tough question, and one that I like to ask all my guests, and that is, you're engaged in public service, and like a lot of public servants, you spend a lot of time in the community and just really helping our neighbors to have better lives. And that's something that it drove me to public service, certainly, and it drove you to public service. And we have similar backgrounds. First, or I was at college, and you might not have, but you were one of the first to go to college too in your family. But I ended up on the Republican side of the coin, and as you point out, and then you ended up on the Democratic side of that coin. What would you say directed you that in that way? What was it about your life experience that ultimately created that drive towards the Democrat Party rather than the other side that might have also been equally as influential in your life?
I think for me, and too, I mentioned my grandfather who had been a coal miner. He actually was part of one of the unions and traveled from northern New Mexico to Washington, D.C. via train early on. And even though my father's family, that they weren't politically engaged in the way you and I might think of the kind of the way we do things now, they certainly thought a lot about those issues. And I think that perhaps one of the distinctions on it at the time was that one party seemed, and this would be the Democratic Party, seemed more in line with what one would call the working people. And then those that were more business oriented, that had an economic side of it, were, if one could generalize in the most general of terms, on the economic side. And so there were differences. And where I particularly saw this, and then growing up, and this was reinforced by someone like Judge Hughes, were some of the great programs that were established by someone like LBJ. And then even during post-World War II, one of the things that my father talked to us a lot about and he didn't talk too much about his World War II experience, because I think the greatest generation was very silent about a lot of that. But it really, really bothered him as he was, seeing the experience on the segregation issues and how important it was going to be to have equality for all. And that was something that he felt pretty strongly about and told us. And so you saw that with Truman, who finally desegregated the armed forces. I think those were the sorts of issues that particularly galvanized me and pushed me in that direction, were some of these concepts of the government providing opportunities for as many people as possible. I look at the GI Bill as one of those examples. And so all of those sorts of concepts seem to move me much more into the Democratic side of the coin, of the ledger, because I saw those as ways to enhance the American dream. And so, we all could talk about different ways that we could do it. And I'm sure you could do that too. And tell us what sort of made you, made you embrace the Republican side in a different way than I would have from what I saw. But I think those were sort of the big issues for me, were those particular ones on trying to create the issues of equality for all, and ensuring that the obstacles that were placed in front of people, like my dad, when he wasn't able to get, housing, fair housing, those sorts of issues.
This theme runs through politically all of my guests, and my more progressive guests will speak about community and neighborhoods and helping others. my more Republican or conservative guests will have, different focus, right? It's going to be tax issues and economics and opportunities and those kinds of things. I know for myself in the legislature, I certainly, over the course of my time in the legislature, became much more centrist in my political views because I could see firsthand the suffering that existed, be it for lack of funding for CPRIT, the cancer fund, or be it lack of housing, affordable housing, and any number of ways that our communities, people that live, not across town, but next door, are really struggling and wanting to do something to help and using the largesse of the government to provide some assistance to these people that wouldn't otherwise have that. Those are the kinds of things that I think drove me to become more of a centrist. And I see that theme. That's not to say that my Republican brothers and sisters don't care equally about people. It's just that those kinds of experiences have an impact on folks and particularly on political opinions. So I want to fast forward a little bit because, again, your list of accolades and accomplishments is deep. One of the things I want to talk about is you were the very first female Latina lawyer who made partner in a major law firm in Texas or Dallas. And so talk to me about that and what that process was like for you.
I think it's one of those issues that as we think about not only they used to call it sort of the double whammy, being a Latina and a woman. When Judge Hughes, who was this incredible mentor of mine and someone who sort of like my grandmother unconditionally loved me and wanted me to succeed and really unconditionally supported women too, because she wanted them to succeed. The stories that we could all tell about what it was like trying to get business, as you know, being a lawyer, that's one of the ways that one succeeds rapidly as a lawyer is to be able to bring in your own business, to bring able to your own clients, not to be dependent on others, but I think they call it rainmaking. And so it was so much harder for women and certainly women of color to be able to access those traditional ways of rainmaking. And one of those was being able to just have lunch with people in downtown Dallas. What had happened in downtown Dallas when I was still an associate, young, just starting out, is that they had these men-only dining rooms in some major clubs downtown. And if you were this young, aspiring lawyer woman who wanted to have lunch with your clients, you wouldn't be able to stay in the main dining hall because those were limited to men. You could go through the buffet line, get your food, but then you had to sit in a room that was in the outside perimeter of this big, large dining room because women weren't allowed. One of the first people to break that down was Judge Hughes. She went through the buffet line, and instead of taking her, her plate to this room that was reserved for her, she just sat down at one of the tables in the main dining hall. And everyone was aghast, but you have to remember, Judge Hughes was a federal judge at this point. And who wanted to tell a federal judge that she wasn't going to be able to sit with everybody and that you had to go sit in this other room? So she effectively sort of started opening up the dining hall. But those were some of the obstacles that, that we faced early on, is that, you didn't have the access. And certainly, into the golf courses and to all of these sorts of rainmaking kinds of opportunities that some of our male colleagues were able to do. I remember some of I was actually practicing real estate law at the time, not being able to go to these real estate club meetings because they were really limiting it to sort of the senior partners who were very familiar with the junior partners the senior partners were all men. And so they would ask the junior partner men to go. And so you didn't get the chance to get to any of these to learn about, ways to do things, and then also the client possibilities. So those were some of the issues that you sort of had to face, as I say, not only as a woman, but also as a woman of color, because you were so unusual.
How did you overcome that? How do you do that?
For me, For me, it was being able to get involved in the community and letting those community folks get to know me, much like my father was able to do in World War II, getting to know other men who then knew him for who he was, for his, great, capabilities and intelligence. And I always thank that one partner of mine at my law firm who encouraged me and nominated me to the very first board of directors I ever served on in a nonprofit. And that opened up a world for me that gave me an opportunity to start meeting others that were in the business community, because I wasn't able to do that through sort of the traditional business side. So, and it was a male partner of mine who did that. And I will always be thankful to him for thinking about me and giving me kind of a way to do things a little differently. And that's actually how I got to know so many more people in Dallas as a result of my engagement in the nonprofit community.
Do you remember the day you made partner?
I do. And it was one of those days that I just stood back and thought, who would have thought that the granddaughter of, grandparents from Mexico who didn't speak English, had no education, would then become a partner in one of the biggest law firms in America, and one of the most well-known law firms. And so I do remember that really, really well. And I wasn't sure that the law firm even recognized what a big deal for me it was, and for the firm, because, I was the first Latina partner in a major law firm in Dallas.
It was a big deal. I mean, again, the glass ceiling for women in law, and women of color, you broke that, and that really made a difference. And, there's some forebearers in Dallas who've done some amazing things, but I think it's really telling about your perseverance and talent and accomplishment to have done that and really blaze the trail for so many others who now have followed in your path. But that wasn't the end. I mean, you make partner at one of the largest, most important law firms in the country, and then you decide maybe it's time to do something else. And so you start serving on boards, you run for Congress, you end up chairing one of the most important committees on poverty. Tell me a little bit about your post-law firm life and some of the things that you feel like are important that we let our listeners know about.
Well, also, as you were mentioning how important it was on the partnership side, one of the very first calls I had from someone congratulating me, and you talk about how, as Latinos, we can be Republicans, we can be Democrats. One of the very first calls I received was from Alberto Gonzalez. Do you remember our Attorney General?
I do.
U.S. Attorney General. He was an associate at one of the Houston law firms, and he was one of the first people to call me to congratulate me. And I will always remember that and think, again, it was sort of that the fact that I think those of us as Latinos recognize, that this was one of those milestones. It might not have been well known among others, lawyers around there, but in our circle, it was just a wonderful to get that call from him. It meant a lot for other Latinos to recognize that and to be supportive. And so I think maybe that's one of the things that I would say about it. One of the areas when you mentioned sort of the post-law school time and post-law firm side, when I was thinking about President Biden and walking into the White House yesterday with his staff, took me back to the day that I was named to the White House staff by President Bill Clinton. And I was the highest ranking Latina in the White House. I was an assistant to the president for intergovernmental affairs. And I remember the day of the inauguration like it was just yesterday. And everything that happened at the inauguration of President Biden, it just brought everything back. And that was the day when you think about days that you think, how my family is looking down at me from heaven, being supportive of me, and that grandmother of mine who had, passed away a number of years before. But that day I walked into the White House, into an office in the West Wing. And if anyone has been to one of those offices in the transition, during the transition of power from one administration to another, what happens is you walk into an office building that is basically totally cleaned out. I walk in, I am the only person, because it was hard, even back then with security, and this is a number of years ago now, it's President Clinton's administration, first term, walking through a gauntlet of security to get into the White House. I had sort of this, ID of some sort, so I got in. And I go into my office and there's no one there yet because I was one of the first people to come from the swearing in because they had asked certain people to be sure to be there as soon as the administration turned, the transition occurred. And so I was one of those people that had been asked to be there as quickly as possible. So I found my way in. I walk in. There's not a piece of paper there. There is nothing. I mean, it's a completely blank, empty office. And the phones are ringing. And so I'm picking up the phone. I'm taking messages. And I found some paper in my purse and a pen, and I'm literally writing down messages because the other people hadn't been able to get in yet, and it had changed. And so I thought of the folks yesterday doing that, and that first day, walking down that path into the West Wing of the White House was one of the most incredible experiences I've ever had, will ever have. And so thankful that so many people sacrificed for me to have that opportunity. But also, I thought to myself, only in America would this have been able to happen.
And that administration was so impactful, right? This was after the one term of H.W. Bush. Clinton comes in, and the expectations, I think, of the country were certainly not what he was probably wanting. I mean, a lot of Republicans were upset. This was right after the Perot, issues of that period of time. And here's this, small governor from a small state coming in. And without great expectation. And then he blows the doors off of it, right? I mean, really, really does some amazing things and becomes one of the most impactful presidents, really, of the century, with the strong economy, lowering the national debt, our relationships around the world. So some really amazing things. I mean, you were on that train during that time. What was that like?
It's interesting that you mentioned and sort of described that sort of how he was being perceived by those. Now, those of us in Dallas had seen him many, many times because, Dallas is the big city for folks in Little Rock. It's not Houston, it's Dallas. And, Hillary at the Rose Law Firm was one of the most important law firms, and they didn't have that many large ones in Little Rock. She had been a partner there as well. They were very, very well known in our legal community and in Dallas because of the proximity, if nothing else. But you're exactly right. I mean, I think that when this was sort of that kind of thought process. It's sort of almost the opposite of what we're seeing right now, where you're seeing, folks who have had decades and decades of experience. Even though Bill Clinton, who was young, at that time, and, early, one of the youngest presidents, he'd been governor for decades, several different iterations. And he had been very involved in the national side on the National Governors Association, et cetera. But that still, I think, when you start bringing in people who had been so new without the kinds of decades of experience that, say, President Bush one had, that was really jarring for people. And I think anytime you have those sort of generational shifts like that one, it was, an extraordinary kind of thought for this country. I mean, it was kind of like you had to go all the way, you'd have to go back to JFK, of somebody that, young coming in with those kinds of, generational changes that really, I think, surprised people. And I think that was what was really hard on it. And for him, I mean, there were things too. I mean, I know that, you saw sort of the White House staff particularly for Biden, who were named, quite a few of them, weeks ago. President Clinton had been very involved in the cabinet side, but didn't really put his White House staff together until just a few days. They weren't announced until just a few days before the inauguration. And I know personally, it was really kind of amazing to get that call to do that, to go to Little Rock on a Thursday and then to come back and go into my office in Dallas at the law firm and say, it's been great working with you, but I'm leaving at noon today because I need to leave to go to Washington for this job. So that was an extraordinary time for people as you saw this generational change.
What an amazing experience. And thank you for your service, right? I mean, that was a big time in the country. And I know that from there, you ended up as an attaché, or actually the speaker at the United Nations. Tell us about that experience.
So I stayed at the White House for a good portion of that year, but it was a really difficult time. Our daughter was very young, and Paul was named the United States Attorney for the Northern District of Texas. I will tell anyone who is thinking about a staff position at the White House or any of these, there is no way that you're going to be able to commute, because it is absolutely the biggest, most you have no other life when you're doing this, because and I think it may have been a little bit different in the earlier administration, but certainly in this one and ones that have preceded it, George W. as an example. The people who are doing these, you are there 24/7 working on some of the biggest issues confronting our world, our country, and you're not going to be able to sort of put it to the side and say, I think I'll kind of go home and I'll be back on Monday. This is not that you leave on a Friday afternoon and come back on a Sunday and be there for Monday morning. It doesn't work that way. And so I've learned so much from that experience, and was just thrilled when President Clinton and the folks asked me to serve as a representative to the United Nations for the General Assembly in 1999, and was able to work very closely with folks in the UN, U.S. mission to the UN, and to deliver a number of speeches on behalf of the U.S. at the UN. And one of the most exciting times was the day that President Clinton was speaking to the General Assembly, to kind of hear him be there, but to also see some of these extraordinary leaders from across the world come in and do these presentations was perhaps just one of the most eye-opening experiences ever. And so, I've always been thankful for that opportunity to have been able to serve on that. And that was, for a good portion of the way it works is the General Assembly works from September through December of every year. So it was great.
What a ride, right? From the dusty hills of Albuquerque and Tucumcari to Wellesley and Harvard, to the hallowed halls of one of the greatest firms in the country, to the White House, to the United Nations. My goodness, it's just an extraordinary story. Let's finish today with your service back home. So you're back in Dallas now. Paul is now working for a major firm, and your community service speaks volumes to your care for our community and for our neighbors. I know a little bit about your work with the former Mayor Rawlings here in Dallas on the Poverty Task Force, and then you ran for mayor of Dallas. So, you're in let's just say Act 2.5 now, and you're serving in the community. What compelled you to be a part of the local community rather than to continue at the national level? Now that your family's a little bit older, you can go back to Washington, but it looks like you're more focused on our fair burg of Dallas here. Tell me about that.
Well, one thing that did happen is I was extraordinarily engaged in the campaign for Hillary Clinton for president. And the day I was in Philadelphia the day before the election, and I remember being in this amazing being in the amazing center of Philadelphia with folks like Springsteen and John Bon Jovi, and you had President Obama and Mrs. Obama, and you had President Clinton, and you had just Vice President Biden. Everybody was there in Philadelphia, and totally expecting to see the next day that there was going to be an election of the first woman president of the United States of America. So I was at the Javits Center the next day, and, the bottom fell out. You could see above you, they literally had balloons that were going to crash down, coming down through. And the reason the Javits pit was selected is because the top of it is glass. And I had been, so this was the thought of breaking the glass ceiling. And so when that didn't occur, and we were in a completely different situation, I decided that I would still remain as active as I could be on the issues that had always been important to me. And those issues included ensuring that all people would have the ability to live the American dream. And, it's in some respects, Jason, it's a lot harder for some of these kids to be able to live the dream that you and I have lived. You're an extraordinary attorney. You have, you're one of the first in your family to go on to college, certainly to law school. You've been a pioneer in so many respects. And I've had the great fortune to have had people behind me supporting me as I've done that. But the kinds of issues that some of these kids have to deal with now, I mean, the poverty levels, the issues of student loans, and just so many other things that they have to deal with that were not nearly as difficult back certainly when I was getting some of these education opportunities. I just wanted to make sure that others had those opportunities as well. And I think that there are things now that just make it a lot difficult, not just for kids of color, but any of the kids now. So I wanted to remain really involved in those issues. I've been involved in a lot of girl serving organizations, some of those national. I certainly became very involved in some of the political ones as well. But I think what really catalyzes for me and galvanized me to say run for political office in terms of mayor were these issues. I just wanted to be sure that we had every kind of obstacle, eliminated so that people could reach their highest and best potential. And so that's really what still guides me right now. I just want to make sure that that we have that American dream available, and that that people recognize that and know that this is the most wonderful country in the world. We've just got to make sure that we give everyone that opportunity, or that they earn the opportunity. I'm not saying give it, but that that the opportunity is available for them to be able to do those sorts of things. And I've really been impressed with a lot of your young people right now who are doing that. But it's not nearly as easy in so many respects. And finding your way through, and now through a pandemic, it's a lot of issues. So that's why I want to stay involved. And for more than anything, it's making sure that our next generation is there to lead us to every kind of height that we can reach in the United States, and that we've always reached. So it's maybe some of the messaging that we've heard from President Biden in terms of, all of us working together. We can do it. There's no reason we can't.
Well, let me just say thank you for your friendship and for your leadership. I think your story really crystallizes for a lot of people what our story as Latinos in America and in Texas really it is, right? We all come from different backgrounds, but we share a bit of a history. And your story from New Mexico to Texas to Harvard and back, and all the different stops in between, I think just shows what a great American story yours is. So thank you, Regina Montoya, for being our guest this week on Our Story. I look forward to next week. I believe the great Chuck Rocha will be with us on Our Story. And thank you for being a part of the Texas Hispanic Policy Foundation's Our Story. I'm Jason Villalba, your host. You can find us online at txhpf.org. And I'll see you next time. Thanks so much, and have a great week.
The Texas Hispanic Policy Foundation would like to thank you for joining us today on Our Story. You can find more information about the foundation at www.txhpf.org, on Facebook on the Texas Hispanic Policy Foundation page, or on Twitter @TexHPF. Please join us next week on Our Story, a podcast dedicated to the voices of Texas Hispanics.